On the morning of September 25th, 2001, in Hawthorne, California, a 27-year-old woman, Crystal Taylor, who was 5 months pregnant, was leaving her apartment to go to work. Suddenly, a man named Skyler Jefferson Moore, who was a member of a gang, walked up behind her and shot her at the back of her head. Crystal, together with her unborn baby, died at the scene as the killer fled away. What hurt the most was that Crystal left behind a 10-year-old son. Later on, as the police launched an investigation into the murder, they discovered that her boyfriend, a man named Derek Paul Smyer, had impregnated her, and he wanted her to abort the pregnancy since he didn't want to be a father. Unfortunately, Crystal had refused to terminate the pregnancy, and she was determined to raise the child even if it means raising it on her own. So Derek hired Skyler to kill her for refusing to abort her unborn baby. Hiring someone to kill your girlfriend because she had refused to abort your baby is pure evil. This is the story of Crystal Taylor. Crystal Dejuana Taylor was born on January 14, 1974 in California. She was born in a family of 3 children who were all girls, and she was the youngest. Crystal was famously known as Chrissy by her family. She was very close to her sisters, and they did everything together. When she was in school, she got into a relationship with a man, but unfortunately, she got pregnant at the age of 17 years old. At that time, she was still in school. She gave birth to a son, but unfortunately, the relationship between her and the father of her son didn't work out, so they went their separate ways. Her family supported her in raising her child. Even though Crystal was a young mother, she prioritized finishing her education first. So after finishing school, she began working. By the year 2001, Crystal, her sisters, and their mother moved into the same apartment complex in the city of Hawthorne, California. Crystal began dating other men because she really wanted to get married. At some point, she began dating a man named Dino, but unfortunately their relationship was on and off. One day, in April 2001, Crystal met a man named Derek at a park. Derek was a man who has been in a relationship before, and he had already had 2 children out of that relationship. Unfortunately, he never wanted to be the father of those children, so during the time that her girlfriend was pregnant with them respectively, he forced her to do an abortion. But when the girlfriend refused, he threatened to kill her. He even attempted the murder, but he was not successful. When her girlfriend discovered that he was trying to kill her, she confided in someone, and then she left the relationship. So when Derek and Crystal met, they entered into a relationship. The two would meet at the park and eat lunch together. Later on, Crystal introduced her boyfriend, Derek, to her coworkers, who joined her a few times for lunch. Unfortunately, 2 months later, their relationship ended. In June 2001, Crystal found out that she was pregnant with Derek's baby, and she decided not to tell him the news for the time being. She decided to keep the baby no matter what, even though she was no longer with Derek, who was the father. On July 23, 2001, she decided to let him know that he was the father of her unborn baby. So while she was at work that day, she asked one of her co-workers to send Derek an email and tell him that she was pregnant. In the email, Crystal also wanted to know if Derek had a sickle cell, which is a blood disorder that someone inherits from the parents. When Derek got the email, he called the coworker. The coworker received Derek's call, and she placed him on loudspeaker so that Crystal and some of their coworkers who were there could hear him. In their conversation, Derek was not happy with Crystal getting pregnant for him. He could be heard saying this had happened in his last relationship, and he didn't want it to happen again. So he begged Crystal's coworker to convince her to do an abortion. However, the coworker told Derek that Crystal didn't want anything from him and that she was capable of raising the child on her own, and she didn't want his money. Derek then told the coworker to keep him updated about what was going on. Unfortunately, a few weeks later, in August 2001, Crystal suddenly began exploring the options of maybe having an abortion, and so her coworker accompanied her to an abortion clinic. When she got to the clinic, she found out that she had gone too far with the pregnancy, but deep inside of her, she wanted to have her baby, so she changed her mind about the abortion. After a visit to the clinic, Crystal met with Derek at her apartment and they talked about the baby for several hours. During their conversation, Derek was certain that he didn't want to have a baby. In early September, Crystal sadly confided in her sisters that Derek didn't want to have the baby. As time went by, their relationship became worse. Crystal's mother later got sick, and so she left California and went to Texas so that she could be cared for by her sister-in-law, who was a nurse. Unfortunately, she didn't get any better, and by September 11th, her health had gotten worse. This forced Crystal and her sisters to go to Texas to check on her. While they were there, Crystal stayed by her mother's side the entire time. That same day, Crystal was arguing with someone on phone. Her aunt heard her yelling to the caller. Crystal told the caller that he can't threaten her, and she added that she was not going to get rid of her baby. According to her aunt, the person she talking to over the phone was called Dig. The aunt then told Crystal to hang up the phone, but an hour later, she heard her again on the phone talking to Dig. She could also hear Dig talking at the other end. She could hear the man asking Crystal what he should do, so the aunt again asked Crystal to hang up. After Crystal had hung the phone, she was really upset, and she started crying, and this made her aunt to become worried about her. The following day, the aunt again saw Crystal arguing with Dig on phone, so she went and took the phone. She now started to become concerned about the relationship that her niece was having. So she urged her and her sister to move to Texas. She even showed them the houses that they could move into. Fortunately, several days later, Crystal's mother began to feel better, so they made plans to return to California since Crystal was scheduled to return to work on September 24th, 2001. Derek found out from Crystal's co-workers that Crystal would be back to work on September 24th, so he eagerly waited for her return. When Crystal returned back to work, Derek called her, and their conversation was not good. So after Crystal hanged up the phone, she started crying. In September 2001, the 27-year-old Crystal Taylor had reached 5 months of her pregnancy, and Derek was still pressuring and threatening her to terminate the pregnancy, something which he had been doing for months. Unfortunately, Crystal had refused to abort the pregnancy, and she was determined to keep the pregnancy. So Derek hired a man named Skyler Moore, who was a member of gang to kill Crystal. So Derek and Skyler met about 2 times planning about the murder. As time went on, Derek and Crystal's arguments became more intense. On September 25th, 2001, Crystal woke up and got ready for work. Her sister, Michelle, picked up her son and took him to school along with her own children at around 6 a.m. That morning, as Crystal was walking out of her apartment to head to work, Skyler walked up behind her and shot her at the back of her head. Crystal, together with her unborn baby, died at the scene. She left behind a 10-year-old son. That morning, before 7:30 a.m., police had received calls for sounds of gunfire at the apartment building where Crystal and her sisters lived. When police arrived at 7:34 a.m., they found Crystal shot in the head and lying on the ground in the doorway of the carport. Unfortunately, they found Crystal and her unborn baby dead. The police had no idea about what happened to Crystal. When they began their investigations, they found Crystal's purse and keys were located on her. They therefore figured out that someone ambushed Crystal and shot her while she was walking to her car. So the police were able to rule out robbery as the cause of death. They were able to locate where she worked, and they went there to talk to her coworkers to see if they could find any information about the case. They talked to several people, including the 2 women who she was friends with, and she had been confiding in about her issues with Derek. They found out that Crystal was actually pregnant, but the father of her child wasn't happy about it. The 2 women also told the detectives that the name of the man who impregnated Crystal was Derek. They even told the detectives where he worked. After speaking to the detectives, one of the co-workers agreed to ride with them to Derek's workplace so that she could help identify him. Unfortunately, when they got there, they didn't find Derek. The co-worker told the detectives that Derek and Crystal often met at Anderson Park for lunch. So they all went to Anderson Park to see if they could find him there. When they arrived at the park, the co-worker saw Derek's silver Mustang car, which had vanity plates, She then saw Derek a few feet away. He was standing and talking to someone. The detectives went for him. They took him to the police station and detained him. They then started questioning him about Crystal's murder, but he denied having any involvement in her death. He, however, told the detectives that they had a brief relationship, and he acknowledged that she was pregnant. He didn't tell the police that the pregnancy was his. Instead, he told them that Crystal was seeing other people. After questioning him, the police searched his car and his apartment, but they didn't find any evidence linking him to the shooting. They also checked his alibi and confirmed that Derek had been at work at the time of the shooting. The police didn't have any evidence that could connect Derek to Crystal's murder. The police also questioned Dino, who was the ex-boyfriend of Crystal, but they had to rule him out because he had an alibi. They also questioned the father of Crystal's son, but he too had an alibi, and they had to also rule him out. When the police spoke to Michelle, who was Crystal's sister, she revealed that the day before the shooting, she saw a strange man wearing a hoodie and a bandana lurking around the apartment building. She told the detectives that when she spoke to the man, she realized that there was something suspicious about him, so she called her sister, Crystal, and told her to be careful. On September 27th, 2001, Michelle sat down with a sketch artist, and they came up with a composite sketch of the man that she had seen that day. The detectives continued with their investigations, and they spoke with several people who lived in the apartment building. They found out that at least 2 people who lived in the apartment building saw the man wearing the hoodie and the bandana the day before the murder. The police knew that they had to find that man and bring him in for questioning. A few days later, the police received a tip that Crystal had been killed by a man named Little C. Stiles. His real name was Skyler Jefferson Moore, and he was a member of a gang known as Crips. When the police showed his picture to Michelle, she positively identified him as the man who she saw on September 24th wearing a hoodie and a bandana. They also showed his picture to the other 2 witnesses, and they also identified Skyler Moore as the man that they had seen that day. In November 2001, Skyler Moore was interviewed by the police, but he denied being involved in Crystal's murder. He told the police that he did not know her. He added that he had seen the police activity outside her apartment that day, but he had nothing to do with what happened. He said that he was only walking by because he was taking his younger brother and sister to school. Fortunately, Skyler Moore confessed to be involved in another murder, which involved the shooting dead of another rival gang member. The police searched Skyler's home, and they found several bandanas, including ones matching the description from the witnesses. They also found gang writings and a .38 caliber unfired bullet. The police knew that Crystal had been killed by a .38 caliber gun. The police felt that they had enough to charge Skyler Moore with the murder of Crystal. Unfortunately, during the preliminary hearing, the court stated that witnesses were either reluctant to testify or were evasive. It was only Michelle and the other witness, who was a child, who were able to identify Skyler Moore during the hearing. Unfortunately, this was not enough for the prosecutors, and the charges were dropped. However, Skyler Moore was charged with the shooting dead of another rival gang member, and therefore he was convicted. After Crystal's murder, the police followed every lead to connect Skyler Moore to Crystal murder. Unfortunately, a lot of time went by, and they didn't find any evidence they needed to prove Skyler's involvement in Crystal's murder. However, Crystal's family believed that he killed Crystal. Unfortunately, 6 months later, Crystal's mother died without knowing who killed her daughter. Years went by, but Crystal's sisters were determined to find her killer. They remembered Derek never wanted Crystal's pregnancy, and they began to figure out that he might had something to do with their sister's death. So they tracked him down and discovered that he had gotten his bachelor's degree, and he had started his own company, and he was living happily. 10 years after her murder, the case went cold, but it was still opened, and there was no lead for the police to follow in the case. In June 2011, the detectives decided that they would go visit Skyler Moore and see if he was ready to talk. But before they could go and talk to Skyler, They first spoke to some gang members who were locked up with Skyler in prison. The gang members revealed that Skyler had a lot of enemies in prison, and he was in solitary confinement. So detectives were going to use what they had learned as leverage to try and get Moore to talk. On June 15th, 2011, two detectives from Los Angeles Sheriff's Office went to visit Skyler Moore in prison. They questioned him and showed him pictures of Derek and Crystal. It was then that he started to talk. He told them that he knew Derek and that they had met at Anderson Park when they were both playing basketball there. He told the officers that he also sold drugs at the park and that he had been trying to recruit Derek into the gang so that he could help him sell drugs there. He said that in September 2001, Derek began complaining to him about Crystal. Derek told him that the pregnancy was not his and that Crystal was just trying to trap him. Skyler revealed to the police that Derek then asked him if he could remove or knock down Crystal, and he accepted the job. Derek then gave him Crystal's address along with her description. He also told him what time she typically left her house to go to work. Skyler told the police that he and Derek spoke about killing Crystal twice. Skyler then went to Crystal's apartment 3 times to try and kill her, but each time he went something happened and he was unable to kill her. However, on September 24th, he jogged over to Crystal's apartment so that he could map out the murder. He then waited in the hallway for Crystal to come down the steps, and then he shot her in the back of the head before leaving the crime scene. Skyler added that a few days later, after the murder, he met Derek, but he didn't seem happy about the murder. He was very nervous, something which made him to think that Derek would go to the police. Derek then began avoiding him, and this made him to become even more suspicious about him. Skyler then told the police that he planned to kill Derek too, but unfortunately he was arrested before he could do it. The detectives then asked him why finally he was confessing about Crystal's murder. He told them that he wasn't affiliated with the gang anymore, and he was now trying to amend for all the bad things that he had done. Shortly after the interview had ended, the police arrested Derek and charged him with first-degree murder of Crystal and her unborn baby with special circumstances, including murder for financial gain and multiple murders, as well as second-degree murder and conspiracy. Skyler Moore was also arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder of Crystal and her unborn baby with special circumstances of lying in wait and multiple murders, along with 1 count of conspiracy. But when the police questioned Derek, he denied any involvement in Crystal's murder. He denied hiring Skyler to kill Crystal. Crystal's coworker had identified Skyler Moore as the last person Derek talked to at Anderson Park the day after the murder. While Derek was in detention awaiting his trial, the police discovered that the mother of his older 2 children had been attacked while she was pregnant with both of his children. During those incidents, Derek had asked her to abort the pregnancies, but she had refused. In the first attack, the woman said that Derek had told her to meet him in an alleyway so that they could go to the doctor, but as she waited, she was attacked by a man with a knife. The man put the knife to her throat, which cut her, but she was ultimately able to fight him off and get away. Detectives again learned that in the year 2002, when Derek's ex was pregnant again for a second time, Derek put his hands over his ex's mouth and threatened to kill the baby. The ex added that one day Derek called her repeatedly, trying to find out her location. She told him that she was at her aunt's house and that she was on her way back to her grandmother's house where she lived. Unfortunately, when she arrived at her grandmother's house, a man attacked her, punched her in the face, and then repeatedly kicked her in the womb and face. After those attacks, the ex confided in someone that she believed that Derek was involved in her being attacked. When Derek's trial started, the prosecutors had enough evidences to show that Derek had hired Skyler Moore to kill Crystal because he didn't want to be a father. The prosecution planned to use Skyler's confession, the witnesses' accounts, and the evidences that they had discovered to prove Derek's guilty in the murder of Crystal. Unfortunately, when the trial began, Skyler Moore, who was the main witness, changed his story, He said that he had died to detectives when he told them that Derek hired him to kill Crystal. Skyler Moore revealed that he confessed the killing of Crystal because he wanted to get a deal from the detectives. Ultimately, the jury was unable to reach a verdict, and a mistrial was declared. The prosecutors planned to try the case again, and when they did, they put both Derek and Skyler on trial together. Fortunately, in the second trial, Derek's own daughter testified against him by revealing how he hated being a father. Michelle and Crystal's co-worker also testified against Derek. Surprisingly, Derek also decided to testify on his own defense. He denied knowing Skyler Moore, and he had never seen him before, and he said that he was a loving father. He also denied having anything to do with the attacks on his ex while she was pregnant. Derek tried his best to convince the jury that all these were just misunderstandings and that he was not capable of committing murder. Unfortunately, the jury did not believe him. It took them less than a day of deliberation, and they found Derek Paul Smyer guilty. On June 1, 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Skyler Moore, his accomplice and triggerman, was also given an additional life sentence. Finally, justice was served 16 years after Crystal's death. Skyler Moore tried to appeal his conviction, but it was upheld, and so he remains in prison.